On February 20th, 1942, during Japan's first air raid on Darwin, Australia, 9 Zeros escorting bombers encountered a scrambled group of P-40 Warhawks. The engagement lasted minutes. The Zero shot down 4 P-40s without losing a single aircraft. The American pilots who survived reported the same frustrating pattern every time they tried to turn with a Zero to get guns on target. The Japanese fighter simply turned tighter, slipped inside their turning radius, and ended up on their tail. It was like trying to outdance a ballerina while wearing lead boots. The statistics from those early months were brutal. In the Philippines, over Wake Island, and throughout the Dutch East Indies, American fighter pilots faced a simple mathematical problem. The Zero could complete a full 360-degree turn in roughly 16 seconds at combat speeds. The F4F Wildcat, America's primary carrier fighter, needed about 19 seconds. The P-40 Warhawk needed even longer. 3 seconds doesn't sound like much until you realize that in a turning dogfight, those 3 seconds meant the Zero could complete its turn, acquire a firing solution, and put 20mm cannon rounds through your cockpit while you were still hauling your aircraft around trying to point your nose at empty sky. But numbers only tell part of the story. The Zero achieved its remarkable turning ability through radical design philosophy. Japanese engineers built an aircraft that weighed just 5,300 lbempty, about 2/3 the weight of an F4F Wildcat. They accomplished this weight savings by stripping away almost all armor protection for the pilot and fuel tanks. No self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal armored plating behind the seat. The Zero was essentially a powerful engine wrapped in tissue paper, trading survivability for pure maneuverability. American pilots didn't know this yet, but they definitely felt the consequences. Every engagement followed a predictable pattern. American pilots would spot Zeros, dive to attack, maybe get off a burst of gunfire, and then Thesaurus would turn to engage. The instant an American pilot tried to turn fight to maneuver his aircraft in a horizontal turning circle to track the enemy, he'd lost. The Zero would simply outturn him, sliding from defender to attacker in seconds. Experienced pilots developed a sick feeling in their stomachs as they hauled back on the stick, knowing they were committing to a contest they couldn't win. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley described the situation in March 1942 after engagements near Guadalcanal. "It's not that our boys lack courage or skill. They have both in abundance, but they're trying to fight by the rules, and the rules don't work anymore. We're teaching them to dogfight, to turn and burn, to stay in the fight against Zeros. That's teaching them to die." His words cut to the heart of the crisis facing American naval aviation. The entire doctrine of fighter combat developed over years of training, and theory had been invalidated in a matter of weeks. The crisis extended beyond individual pilot survival. Air superiority in the Pacific depended on winning these fighter versus fighter engagements. If American fighters couldn't protect dive bombers and torpedo planes, carrier task forces couldn't effectively strike Japanese targets. If fighters couldn't protect bases and bomber formations, America's offensive capability evaporated. The Zero problem wasn't just about dogfighting. It threatened the entire strategic picture in the Pacific theater. Pilots started calling it Zero fever, the moment of cold realization when you're in a turning fight with a Japanese fighter, and you understand he's going to complete his turn before you do. Some pilots froze. Others made desperate maneuvers that only made things worse. A few started thinking differently, and those few began to notice something interesting about the Zero's behavior. Commander John Smith Thatch, everyone called him Jimmy, had a problem that kept him awake at night aboard the USS Lexington in early 1942. As the commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3, he was responsible for keeping his pilots alive, while they faced an enemy aircraft that outclassed their Wildcats in almost every measurable way. Thatch was an unusual naval officer for his time. He didn't just fly, he studied. While other squadron commanders focused on gunnery practice and formation flying, Thatch spent hours poring over after-action reports, debriefing returning pilots and running calculations on scratch paper. By April 1942, Thatch had collected enough data to see the pattern clearly. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros shared common experiences. They described how the Zero pilot would latch onto a target and follow through a turning engagement with almost supernatural precision. The Japanese pilot knew his aircraft could outturn anything American, so he'd commit fully to the turn, tightening his radius, accepting higher G-forces, confident that his quarry would run out of turning performance first. This confidence became predictable, and predictability, Thatch realized, could be exploited. Thatch observed something else in the debriefings that most officers dismissed as combat stress or confused recollection. Multiple pilots reported that when they'd attempted radical maneuvers, sudden dives, unexpected climbs, or aggressive throttle reductions, Zero pilots sometimes seemed surprised. The Japanese flyers had grown accustomed to American pilots fighting in a particular way, maintaining speed, attempting to turn, and eventually dying. Anything that deviated from this pattern seemed to momentarily confuse the enemy. These were small moments, usually not enough to save the pilot's life, but they were moments nonetheless. The breakthrough came when Thatch interviewed Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare after his extraordinary performance on February 20th, 1942. Hare had single-handedly defended the Lexington against 9 Japanese bombers, shooting down 5. But what interested Thatch wasn't the bombers. It was how Hare had dealt with the escorting Zeros. O'Hare described making high-speed slashing attacks, firing, and then refusing to turn. Instead, he'd used his Wildcat's superior diving speed to disengage, zoom back up to altitude, using that speed as energy, and attack again. He never let a Zero pull him into a turning fight. Thatch started running experiments using matchsticks on his desk. He'd push 2 matchsticks around, simulating different tactical approaches. The problem was isolation. If a Zero got on your tail and you couldn't outturn him, you were dead. But what if you weren't alone? What if your wingman could become your weapon? He moved the matchsticks in crossing patterns, creating situations where a Zero pursuing one Wildcat would inevitably fly into the guns of another. The geometry was simple, but it required perfect coordination and absolute trust between pilots. On May 10, 1942, Thatch gathered his squadron pilots in the Lexington's ready room and explained what he'd developed. He called it the beam defense position, though it would become immortalized as the Thatcha. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of fighting individually, 2 Wildcats would fly parallel courses about 200 ft apart. When a Zero attacked one plane, both Wildcats would turn toward each other in a crisscross pattern. The Zero, committed to pursuing the first Wildcat through the turn, would suddenly find the second Wildcat crossing directly in front of him, guns blazing. If the Zero broke off to avoid being shot, the first Wildcat was safe. If the Zero continued pursuing, he'd fly straight into a hail of 50 caliber bullets. But Thatch was developing more than just the weave. He was documenting something more fundamental about Zero tactics. Japanese pilots, he noted, had fallen into patterns based on their aircraft's superiority. They expected American pilots to fight in specific ways, to turn, to try to dogfight, to play by rules that favored the Zero. This expectation created tunnel vision. Zero pilots would commit to pursuit with such confidence that they'd ignore warning signs. They'd follow American fighters into situations that a more cautious pilot would recognize as traps. That shared his observations with every squadron commander who'd listened. He wrote detailed tactical memos that circulated through the fleet. Some of his ideas were dismissed. Senior officers who'd never faced a Zero thought Thatch was overcomplicating simple fighter tactics. But the pilots who'd survived combat in the South Pacific read Thatch's reports like scripture. Here was someone who understood what they were facing, and who was thinking systematically about solutions rather than just demanding more courage or better gunnery. The real test would come at midway. The Thatch Weave looked absurd on paper. Naval aviation doctrine since World War I emphasized formation integrity, mutual support through defensive circles, and individual dogfighting prowess. Now Thatch was telling pilots to deliberately turn toward the enemy, to cross flight paths with their wingmen at high speed, and to trust that geometry and timing would save them instead of superior turning performance. It violated every instinct that fighter pilots had developed. Thatch drilled his pilots relentlessly during the voyage to Midway in late May 1942. 2 Wildcats would take off and practice the scissoring motion over and over. Turn toward each other. Pass, turn back, pass again. The pattern created a woven defensive zone that was nearly impossible for a single attacker to penetrate, but it required absolute precision. If the timing was off by even a second, the 2 Wildcats could collide. If one pilot hesitated or misjudged the crossing point, the weave collapsed and both aircraft became vulnerable. Thatch's pilots practiced until the maneuver became instinctive until they could execute it, while under fire with their adrenaline screaming and their hands shaking. On June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway provided the ultimate testing ground. Thatch led his division of 6 Wildcats as escort torpedo bombers attacking the Japanese carrier fleet. At 0920 hours, Zero swarmed the formation. Thatch saw his worst nightmare materializing. More than a dozen Zeros diving on his outnumbered Wildcats. He immediately went into the weave with his wingman, Annan Robert Ramdib. The Zero latched onto Thatch's tail and followed him into the turn with predictable aggression. The Japanese pilot was flying exactly as Thatch had theorized, committed fully to the pursuit, confident in his aircraft's superior turning ability, focused entirely on the target in front of him. Dib crossed in front of Thatch at a combined closing speed of nearly 500 mm. The Zero pilot suddenly found himself flying directly into Dib's gun sight with less than 2 seconds to react. Dib's 650 caliber machine guns shredded the Zero's unarmored airframe. The aircraft disintegrated. Thatch immediately reversed his turn, weaving back across Dib's flight path. Another Zero that had been pursuing Dib now faced the same geometry problem. Thatch's guns were pointed directly at him. The Zero pilot broke off, unwilling to fly into certain death. In less than 30 seconds, the weave had destroyed one Zero and forced another to disengage. The engagement continued for nearly 20 minutes. Thatch's division kept weaving, kept crossing, kept turning toward each other instead of away. The Zeros, accustomed to picking off isolated American fighters, couldn't crack the formation. Every time a Zero committed to an attack, he flew into a crossfire. Japanese pilots who'd grown comfortable with American predictability suddenly faced something entirely new. Some adapted and broke off. Others, locked into their attack mindset, pressed forward and died. By the time Thatch's division returned to the Yorktown, they'd shot down 3 Zeros confirmed and driven off at least 5 others. More importantly, they'd protected the torpedo bombers long enough for the attack to develop, even though the torpedo attack itself proved largely ineffective due to other tactical problems. Word of the weave spread through the Pacific Fleet within days. Pilots who'd felt helpless against Zero snow had a concrete defensive tactic that worked. But the weave represented something larger than just a clever maneuver. It fundamentally changed how American pilots thought about fighter combat. The old doctrine emphasized individual skill and aircraft performance. The new doctrine emphasized teamwork, tactical discipline, and exploiting enemy psychology. You didn't need to outturn a Zero if you could outthink the Zero pilot. Fighter squadrons throughout the Pacific began adapting the weave to their own needs. Some versions used 4 aircraft instead of 2, creating even more complex crossing patterns. Others modified the timing and spacing based on whether they were flying Wildcats, P-40s, or the new P-38 Lightnings that were beginning to arrive in theater. The core principle remained constant. Turn toward your wingman, force the enemy to choose between breaking off or flying into guns, and never fight the way the enemy expects you to fight. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was significant. Intelligence reports from captured documents and interrogated prisoners revealed that Zero pilots had begun approaching combat more cautiously by late 1942. The easy victories of early 1942 were over. American formations that weaved and scissored were dangerous in ways that went beyond simple numerical odds. The Japanese tactical advantage, their aircraft's superior maneuverability, had been neutralized not through better engineering, but through better thinking. While Thatch's weave solved the problem of what to do when a Zero got on your tail, it didn't address the fundamental question that kept nagging at American fighter pilots. How do you fight an enemy you can't outturn without waiting to be attacked first? The answer came from an unlikely source: pilots who'd survived by refusing to dogfight at all. These pilots had stumbled onto something that would become the cornerstone of American fighter doctrine for the rest of the war: energy fighting. Major John L. Smith of Marine Fighting Squadron 223 arrived at Guadalcanal's Henderson Field in August 1942, with a simple philosophy that he drummed into every pilot under his command. Altitude is life, speed is life, turning is death. Smith had studied the early combat reports obsessively and reached a conclusion that seemed almost cowardly to traditionally minded fighter pilots: never under any circumstances turn with a Zero. Instead, his pilots would use the one advantage their aircraft actually possessed: diving speed and structural strength. The physics were straightforward. A Wildcat weighed about 7,900 lb fully loaded compared to the Zero's 5,300 lb. In level flight at the same speed, both aircraft had the same kinetic energy, but in a dive, the heavier Wildcat accelerated faster and could reach higher speeds before structural limits kicked in. The Zero's lightweight construction, the same feature that made it turn so beautifully, became a liability in vertical maneuvers. Zero pilots who dove too aggressively risked overstressing their airframes. American pilots in Wildcats, P-40s, and especially the rugged P-47 Thunderbolts that arrived later, could dive at speeds that would tear a Zero apart. Smith's pilots executed what became known as boom and zoom attacks. They'd patrol at high altitude, typically 20,000 FT or higher, maintaining what pilots called an energy advantage. When they spotted Zeros below them, they'd dive at high speed, fire a quick burst at the target, and then use their diving speed to zoom back up to altitude before the Zeros could react. The attack lasted seconds. If the burst connected, the Zero went down. If it missed, the American pilot didn't stick around to see. He converted his speed back into altitude and set up for another attack. The Zeros below could turn and twist all they wanted. They couldn't catch an aircraft that refused to fight in their arena. Captain Joe Foss, who would end the war as one of America's top aces with 26 victories, described the energy fighting doctrine in blunt terms during a debriefing in November 1942. The Zero wants you to turn. That's his game. So don't play it. Stay above him, stay fast. Hit him when he's not looking and get out before he can respond. It's not about being brave or proving you're a better pilot in a fair fight. It's about killing the enemy and going home alive. Fouke's words captured the fundamental mindset shift that was happening across the Pacific theater. The concept of energy management went deeper than just diving and climbing. Pilots learned to think of their aircraft as a reservoir of energy that existed in two forms: kinetic energy from speed and potential energy from altitude. Every maneuver either spent energy or traded one form for another. A sharp turn bled off speed. It converted kinetic energy into angular momentum, and through air resistance into waste heat. A climb traded kinetic energy for potential energy. A dive did the reverse. The goal was to maintain higher total energy than your opponent, which meant you controlled the terms of engagement. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, who'd earlier lamented the inadequacy of traditional dogfighting tactics, became one of the most vocal advocates for energy fighting. By September 1942, he developed a training program that used chalk talks and blackboard diagrams to teach pilots how to visualize energy states during combat. He'd draw two aircraft and ask, "This Zero is at 15,000 FT doing 180 knots. You're at 20,000 FT doing 250 knots. Who has the energy advantage?" The answer was always the aircraft with more total energy, and that aircraft got to decide whether to fight or flee. This approach required discipline that went against every fighter pilot's aggressive instincts. When you dove on a Zero and missed, every bone in your body wanted to pull around and try again. You just traveled 5,000 FT at screaming speed. Your target was right there, and turning to re-engage felt natural. But that turn bled off all your speed. Suddenly, you were in the Zero's energy state, slow and vulnerable. The Zero pilot who'd been defensive moments before could now reverse the situation. Pilots who couldn't resist that temptation died. The throttle-down overshoot technique emerged from desperate situations where everything else had already gone wrong. You'd lost your altitude advantage. A Zero had gotten on your tail despite your best efforts. The weave wasn't an option because your wingman was somewhere else fighting his own battle. Energy fighting doctrine said you should never be in this position. But combat is chaos, and sometimes theory meets reality in the worst possible way. This is where pilots discovered that the throttle lever itself could become a weapon. Ensign James Sweat stumbled onto the technique accidentally on April 7, 1943, during a massive Japanese air raid in Guadalcanal. A Zero had latched onto his tail after Sweat had exhausted his altitude and speed advantages. During a frantic engagement with dive bombers, Sweat was hauling his Wildcat through violent maneuvers, but the Zero pilot matched every turn, creeping closer. Sweat's aircraft was already damaged, losing hydraulic fluid, and he knew he had maybe 30 seconds before those 20 mm cannons chewed through his empennage. In desperation, he did something that violated every instinct. He chopped his throttle to idle. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Wildcat's deceleration threw Sweat forward against his shoulder harness. Behind him, the Zero pilot had been tracking his target's speed, adjusting his own throttle to maintain firing position. When Sweat's aircraft suddenly slowed, the Zero's momentum carried it forward. In aerial combat, this is called an overshoot. The Zero flashed past Sweat's left wing, suddenly transforming from predator to prey. Sweat rammed his throttle forward, pulled his nose up slightly, and fired a toucan burst into the Zero's belly as it hung in front of him. The Japanese aircraft rolled inverted and plunged into the sea. The physics behind the throttle-down overshoot are rooted in momentum and reaction time. An aircraft traveling at 200 mm covers about 410 ft per second. When a pursuing pilot sees his target suddenly decelerate, several things happen in sequence. First, there's a recognition lag. The human brain needs roughly half a second to register that the target speed has changed. Then there's a decision lag, another quarter second to decide what to do about it. Then there's an action lag, the time it takes to physically move your hand to the throttle or stick. By the time the pursuing pilot has reduced power and applied appropriate back pressure to avoid overshooting, he's already traveled 200 to 300 ft closer than he intended. But the technique was far more sophisticated than simply pulling the throttle back and hoping for the best. Pilots who survived to refine the method discovered that timing and situation awareness were everything. You couldn't reduce throttle too early. The pursuing pilot would have time to adjust and would simply slow down with you, maintaining his firing position. You couldn't reduce throttle too late. If the enemy was already in effective firing range, you'd just make yourself an easier target. The sweet spot was when the pursuing aircraft was about 2 to 3 seconds from optimal firing position, close enough that the pilot was focused on his gun sight and target tracking rather than gross maneuvering. The technique also required understanding your pursuer's mindset. Zero pilots by mid-1943 had developed specific attack patterns based on hundreds of successful engagements. They'd close to within 200 ft, settle into position slightly behind and below their target, and then fire a methodical burst aimed at the cockpit and engine. This attack profile was consistent and predictable, which made it exploitable. A Zero pilot who'd positioned himself for this killing shot had committed his aircraft to a specific flight path and speed. He expected his target to either maintain speed or accelerate desperately. A sudden deceleration wasn't in his tactical playbook. Marine Captain Jefferson DeLance scored 9 victories. During the Guadalcanal campaign described, teaching the throttle-down technique to replacement pilots in early 1943, I tell them to think of it like playing chicken but in reverse. The Zero pilot thinks he's won. He's settling in for the kill. That confidence makes him predictable. When you chop throttle, you're betting that his momentum and his expectations will carry him past you before he can react. It's not a comfortable feeling. Your speed drops, your controls get mushy, and every instinct screams that you're doing something wrong. But if you time it right, you get 1 or 2 seconds where he's in front of you and you're still alive to shoot. The throttle-down maneuver had limitations that pilots learned through trial and error. It was a one-time trick. Once you'd executed it, you'd bled off most of your airspeed and energy. If you missed your shot when the enemy overshot, you were in serious trouble, slow and vulnerable with no energy reserve. It also didn't work well against multiple attackers. While you might force one Zero to overshoot, his wingman would simply adjust and shoot you during your low-speed recovery. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had validated Thatch's Weave under combat conditions. But it was Guadalcanal that became the proving ground, where energy tactics and throttle management transformed from experimental techniques into standard doctrine. Henderson Field, captured by Marines on August 7, 1942, sat at the center of a 6-month meat grinder that pilots called the slot. Japanese aircraft flew down from Rabaul almost daily, and American fighters launched from Henderson's muddy, shellacked runway to intercept them. This was where theory met reality repeatedly, violently, and without mercy. Marine Fighting Squadron 223, led by Major John L. Smith, arrived at Henderson on August 20, 1942, with 19 Wildcats. Smith's pilots had been thoroughly indoctrinated in energy fighting principles before they ever reached Guadalcanal. No turning with Zeros. Maintain altitude, dive, shoot, climb. On August 24th, during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Smith's squadron intercepted a large formation of Japanese bombers and their Zero escorts. The Marines stayed high, dove through the Zero screen at over 350 mph, shot down 4 bombers in the first pass, and zoomed back to altitude before the Zeros could effectively respond. The surviving Zero pilots turned and twisted below, demonstrating their superior maneuverability to empty sky while Smith's pilots set up for another diving attack. The engagement statistics from those first weeks at Guadalcanal told a remarkable story. In August 1942, Marine and Navy fighters operating from Henderson Field shot down 42 Japanese aircraft while losing 16 of their own, a ratio of roughly 2.6 to 1. By comparison, the fighting in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies 6 months earlier had seen ratios that often favored the Japanese. The difference wasn't better aircraft. The Wildcats at Guadalcanal were the same models that had struggled earlier. The difference was tactics. American pilots were no longer fighting the way the Zero's design wanted them to fight. Captain Marian Carl, who became the first Marine Corps ace at Guadalcanal, described a typical engagement on September 9, 1942, that illustrated how throttle management had become integrated into standard combat procedure. Carl had bounced a Zero from above, made his firing pass, and was climbing back to altitude when he noticed his speed had dropped more than intended. A second Zero had maneuvered behind him during his climb. Carl continued his climb for another 3 seconds, watching his airspeed indicator drop from 210 to 180 knots, letting the Zero close the distance. Then he simultaneously reduced throttle to idle and deployed his landing flaps, a double deceleration that killed his airspeed dramatically. The Zero overshot so violently that it passed nearly 100 ft ahead of Carl's nose. Carl retracted his flaps, shoved his throttle forward, and destroyed the Zero with a deflection shot as it tried to dive away. The Japanese naval aviators were not stupid or inflexible. They recognized that American tactics had changed and attempted to adapt. By October 1942, Japanese fighter pilots operating over Guadalcanal began staying higher and fighting more cautiously. Some adopted slashing attacks similar to American boom and zoom tactics, but they faced a fundamental problem. The Zero's design optimized for turning performance at moderate speeds. When Zero pilots tried to fight energy battles at high speed and high altitude, they surrendered the advantages their aircraft provided without gaining equivalent benefits. A Zero attempting to boom and zoom was mediocre at best. A Wildcat using energy tactics was leveraging its actual strengths. The naval battle of Guadalcanal on November 12, 13, 1942, provided a dramatic demonstration of how far American fighter tactics had evolved in just 6 months. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley led a combat air patrol of 8 Wildcats when a large Japanese strike approached the American fleet. Rather than charging directly at the incoming raid, Flatley positioned his division 5,000 ft above the Japanese formation and slightly to the side, maintaining both altitude and positional energy advantage. His pilots made repeated diving attacks on the bomber formation, with each Wildcat completing 3 or 4 individual boom and zoom runs. The escorting Zeros attempted to intercept but found themselves constantly reacting, rather than controlling the engagement. Flatley's division shot down 7 bombers and 2 Zeros without losing a single aircraft. The improvement in kill ratios became even more pronounced as 1942 ended. In November and December, American fighters in the Solomons achieved rates of nearly 4-to-1 against Japanese aircraft. Captured Japanese documents and prisoner interrogations revealed a growing respect and fear of American fighter tactics. One Japanese naval aviator shot down and captured in December 1942 told interrogators that Zero pilots had been instructed to avoid extended engagements with American fighters that maintained altitude advantage, noting that the Americans no longer fight foolishly. Henderson Field became an informal tactical laboratory where successful techniques spread through direct pilot-to-pilot instruction. Veterans would take new arrivals aside and explain exactly how to execute throttle-down overshoots, how to judge energy states, how to recognize when a Zero pilot was committed to an attack pattern. This wasn't formal doctrine yet. The training manuals back in the United States still largely taught traditional dogfighting. But in the South Pacific, a new way of fighting was being forged through necessity and refined through survival. By early 1943, the United States Navy and Marine Corps recognized they had a problem. A good problem, but a problem nonetheless. Experienced pilots in the Pacific had developed highly effective tactics against Japanese fighters. But this knowledge existed primarily in the heads of combat veterans and in scattered after-action reports. New pilots arriving straight from stateside training were still being taught to dogfight, to turn with the enemy, to rely on individual aerial combat prowess. The Navy needed to institutionalize what had been learned in blood over Guadalcanal and turn battlefield innovations into systematic training doctrine. The Naval Air Station at Jacksonville, Florida, became the epicenter of this tactical revolution in fighter training. In February 1943, Commander John Thatch himself was ordered back from the Pacific to redesign the fighter training curriculum. Thatch brought with him reams of combat data, gun camera footage, and debriefing transcripts. He also brought something more valuable, the credibility of a combat commander who developed tactics that actually worked and kept pilots alive. When Thatch spoke, instructors listened. When he said traditional dogfighting training was killing pilots, The Navy began changing how it taught fighter combat. The new curriculum at Jacksonville and other training bases reflected a complete philosophical shift. Student pilots learned energy management before they learned aerobatics. Instructors used classroom physics demonstrations to illustrate kinetic and potential energy concepts. One particularly effective teaching method involved rolling balls down ramps of different heights. Students could physically see how a ball starting from higher up, more potential energy, would hit harder and roll farther, more kinetic energy, than a ball starting lower. The message was simple. Altitude equals energy equals life. The pilot who starts higher controls the fight. Throttle discipline became a specific training module. Student pilots flew practice engagements where instructors in faster aircraft would get on their tail, simulating a zero attack. The students had to execute throttle-down maneuvers while maintaining aircraft control, timing the deceleration to force and overshoot, and then recovering quickly enough to convert defense into offense. The training was nerve-wracking. Reducing throttle with an instructor on your tail felt suicidal, but it built the muscle, memory, and confidence needed to execute the technique under actual combat stress. Instructors noted that students who mastered throttle management in training showed significantly better survival rates in their first 3 combat missions, the period when inexperienced pilots were most vulnerable. The Fighter Tactics Manual, published in May 1943, formalized what Pacific veterans had discovered empirically. The manual explicitly stated that pilots should avoid turning engagements with Japanese fighters. It provided specific altitude and speed recommendations for different tactical situations. It described the Thatch Weave in detail with diagrams showing crossing angles and timing. Most importantly, it explained the why behind each tactic, not just what to do, but the physics and psychology that made these techniques effective. This was revolutionary for military doctrine, which traditionally told soldiers what to do without extensive explanation. Training also emphasized recognition and decision-making under pressure. Students learned to identify aircraft silhouettes instantly and assess tactical situations in seconds. Is that enemy aircraft above or below you? What's your relative speed? Do you have an energy advantage? Can you disengage if the engagement goes poorly? These questions needed to become automatic, processed faster than conscious thought. Instructors created pressure scenarios during training flights, simulated emergencies, multiple attackers, low-fuel situations, forcing students to make life or death decisions while managing their aircraft's energy state. The Marine Corps established a similar training pipeline at Marine Corps Air Station El Centro in California's Imperial Valley. Marine instructors, many of them Guadalcanal veterans, brought an even more aggressive edge to energy fighting doctrine. They emphasized that maintaining altitude discipline required almost painful patience. New pilots wanted to dive on every target they saw, burning their energy advantage for a low-probability shot. Veterans taught them to wait, toe stalk, to position themselves so perfectly that the enemy never knew the attack was coming until bullets started hitting. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Indian Joe Bauer, a Medal of Honor recipient and a Guadalcanal veteran, told students, "The successful fighter pilot is patient, calculating, and ruthless. Gallantry is for movies. Efficiency is for survival." By mid-1943, every fighter pilot graduating from Navy and Marine Corps training programs had been thoroughly indoctrinated in energy tactics and throttle management. They'd practiced the Thatch Weave until they could execute it while half asleep. They'd done forced overshoot drills until reducing throttle in a defensive situation felt natural rather than terrifying. They understood that their Wildcats, Corsairs, or Hellcats couldn't outturn a Zero, so they'd never try. This standardized training meant that veteran squadron commanders in the Pacific could trust that replacement pilots arriving in theater already understood the fundamentals of how to fight and survive. The results validated the training investment. In the second half of 1943, as fully trained pilots flooded into Pacific squadrons, American fighter kill ratios against Japanese aircraft climbed above 5-1 and kept rising. These weren't veteran aces achieving these numbers. These were average pilots applying systematic tactics they'd learned in training. The institutional knowledge that had been confined to combat veterans in early 1943 had become standard competency across the entire fighter force by year's end. The throttle lever, once just a speed control, had been transformed into a tactical weapon that every American fighter pilot knew how to employ. The throttle-down overshoot technique and the broader energy fighting doctrine it exemplified represented something more profound than just clever aerial tactics. They demonstrated how American military culture, when properly motivated, could systematically analyze problems, adapt to enemy strengths, and develop solutions faster than adversaries could counter-adapt. The Japanese had spent the 1930s perfecting the Zero and training elite naval aviators to exploit its capabilities. Americans spent 6 months in 1942 figuring out how to neutralize a decade of Japanese investment, then institutionalize that knowledge across thousands of pilots. This adaptability created a compounding advantage that extended far beyond individual dogfights. By late 1943, Japanese naval aviation was trapped in a vicious cycle. Their most experienced pilots, the veterans who dominated the early war, were dead, shot down by Americans who'd learned not to fight on Japanese terms. Replacement pilots received abbreviated training because Japan lacked the fuel, time, and safe airspace to properly develop aviators. These inexperienced pilots flew the same Zeros that had terrorized the Pacific in 1942, but without veteran leadership and against American pilots who'd been systematically trained in tactics specifically designed to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. The aircraft hadn't changed. The quality of the pilots flying them had collapsed. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19, 1944 starkly illustrated this transformation. American carrier fighters, now primarily F-6F Hellcats, which combined the Wildcats' ruggedness with significantly better performance, intercepted massive Japanese strikes during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American pilots maintained altitude discipline, used energy tactics, and employed throttle management when necessary. The Japanese lost approximately 600 aircraft over 2 days, while American losses totaled about 120, with most of those lost to operational accidents rather than combat. The kill ratio exceeded 10 to 1. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. The Zero hadn't become obsolete. The tactics to defeat it had become universal. The intellectual framework that produced throttle-down tactics influenced American military thinking beyond just fighter aviation. The same analytical approach studied the enemy's strengths, identify the assumptions underlying those strengths, develop tactics that invalidate those assumptions appeared across multiple domains. Submarine commanders studied Japanese anti-submarine doctrine and developed tactics to exploit its gaps. Bomber formations analyzed fighter attack patterns and modified their defensive arrangements. The military became a learning organization that treated enemy capabilities not as fixed obstacles, but as problems to be solved through systematic analysis and tactical innovation. Perhaps most remarkably, the throttle technique exemplified how warfare rewards those who question assumptions and challenge conventional wisdom. Traditional fighter doctrine said you fought by turning and maneuvering. Every instinct said that when someone was chasing you, you should go faster, not slower. The idea of deliberately reducing speed when an enemy was on your tail seemed insane, until pilots desperate enough or creative enough to try it discovered that insanity sometimes worked better than sanity. Jimmy Thatch pushing matchsticks around his desk. Marian Carl chopping his throttle with a Zero behind him. John Smith drilling his pilots to never turn. These weren't acts of martial genius. They were acts of intellectual courage, the willingness to try something different when conventional approaches were producing corpses. The Japanese, for their part, never developed equivalent adaptive capacity during the Pacific War. The Zero remained essentially unchanged from 1942 through 1945, despite American tactics rendering its advantages increasingly irrelevant. Japanese training doctrine continued emphasizing individual skill and aggressive engagement even as their pilot quality declined catastrophically. When American pilots learned throttle discipline and energy management, they shared that knowledge systematically. When Japanese pilots developed techniques to counter American tactics, and some did, that knowledge rarely spread beyond individual units. The organizational culture that produced the Zero's excellence couldn't adapt when that excellence proved insufficient. The tactical evolution that began with pilots desperately trying not to die. Fighting Zeros established patterns that defined American air combat doctrine through the jet age and beyond. Korean War pilots flying F-86 Sabres against MiG-15s used energy tactics and throttle management derived directly from World War II experience. Vietnam-era fighter pilots who'd forgotten these lessons and tried to turn fight agile. MiG-17s and heavy F-4 Phantoms relearned, them painfully leading to the establishment of Top Gun and other advanced fighter training programs that re-emphasized the energy fighting, Principles developed over Guadalcanal. Modern fighter pilots still learn about energy states, overshoot mechanics, and the importance of controlling engagement geometry. Concepts that would be immediately recognizable to Jimmy Thatch or Marian Carl. The throttle lever itself became a symbol of this larger transformation. It was always there in the cockpit, a simple mechanical control that every pilot used dozens of times per flight. But nobody thought of it as a weapon until circumstances forced creativity. That's the essential lesson. The tools to solve problems often already exist. What's required is the vision to see familiar objects in unfamiliar ways, the courage to try unconventional approaches, and the discipline to systematically teach what works. American fighter pilots in 1942 didn't wait for better aircraft to defeat the Zero. They used the aircraft they had, the physics that governed all flight, and the creativity that desperation unlocks. They pulled the throttle back when every instinct said to push it forward, and in doing so they transformed hunters into prey, turned Japan's greatest aerial weapon into an obsolete relic, and proved that adaptation beats perfection when perfection can't adapt. The Zero pilots who confidently committed to pursuit, expecting another easy victory, instead found themselves overshooting past their target, suddenly vulnerable in the last seconds they'd ever experience. The throttle had spoken.